to be part of the kingdom. And he's the Lord of redemption. In verses 18 to 22 that we examined last week, it's the question of feasting versus fasting. Probably prompted by the dinner with Levi's buddies, and the religious leaders say, hey, wait a minute, how come your guys are feasting and our people are fasting? And it prompted that discussion, as we looked at last week, where Jesus demonstrated he's the Lord of change. That when he shows up, things change. They change how we relate to God. We no longer relate through trying to be good enough for God, working our way to heaven. But we now relate through God's grace and a whole new relationship with him as he is the bridegroom. Hallelujah. This morning we'll see the fourth and the fifth scenes in this drama where the disciples work on the Sabbath, Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and Jesus will demonstrate that he is the Lord over the Sabbath. He is the Lord not over the seventh day of the week, but every other day as well. And as we've talked about with these situations, is that as you put them together and you read them, you see that the temperature rises the farther you get into these scenes and scenarios. And the anxiety, the antagonism builds. Where the beginning of chapter 2, the religious leaders probably look at Jesus and see him as an irritation, as maybe a mild annoyance. By the time you get to verse 6 of chapter 3, they want to kill him. They have had enough, and it's time to do something and get rid of him. And we'll see that this morning as well. So let's refocus back in verse 23 as we look at this whole idea of harvesting on the Sabbath. So once again, in that passage, it says, one day he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath? You can't do that. And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God at the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So as verse 23 tells us, Jesus and his disciples are apparently on a journey of some type. And as they're walking along, they come to a grain field. And they're either walking beside the grain field, or perhaps they're walking on a path that goes through the grain field. It could be either way, but as they're doing that, and as the disciples are walking along, they're apparently hungry. And the Old Testament law allowed you that when you were walking through a grain field, you could take handfuls of grain and snack on it, basically. You couldn't bring out a scythe or a sickle to harvest grain if it didn't belong to you, but you could help yourself to a handful. So apparently that's what these men are doing as they're walking along. It's probably either wheat or barley, and they grab some of the grain and take that and probably rub it together to get the chaff off, and then blow the chaff away so that they've got the seed or the nut that they can then eat. And then if you've grown up on a farm, you know that that's an acceptable thing, and it's a tasty snack, and so that's taking place as that situation. And so as they're walking along, apparently they've also got company. That there are the religious leaders, the Pharisees, who are also present. And they immediately point out and say, hey, well, did you see what they just did? That's not right. You can't do that on the Sabbath. It's interesting that they pick on the harvesting part. The rules for the Sabbath that they had generated also said you couldn't take a journey on the Sabbath. You could walk 1,999 steps, and that was okay. That's, I think it's about, 800 meters, something like that. Well, once you reach the 2,000th step, then you were on a journey. One step short of that, it's not that far away. But man, you cross that line. It's interesting, they don't pick on that. They don't pick on the fact that they're on a journey. They're too far away from home. what they pick on is harvesting. Now, if you go back to the Old Testament, what the law for the Sabbath was in Exodus 34, verse 21, it says, 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. So as you read that verse, what you discover is that the purpose of the Sabbath, the purpose of the seventh day, is a day of rest. It's a day to kick back. You've worked hard for 6 days. It's time to relax. It's time to enjoy. It's time to, breathe a sigh of relief and just enjoy yourself. The problem is that the Pharisees had flipped that command around. And instead of the Sabbath day being a day that you should rest, what they had said is that, no, what it means is you can't work on the Sabbath. Which is a whole different viewpoint from saying you should rest on the Sabbath and saying you can't work on the Sabbath. In fact, they had to define 39 different types of work that you could not do. 1/3 of which related to harvesting. Because the idea of grabbing the grain, that's reaping. Rubbing it together, that's threshing. Blowing the chaff, that's winnowing. Hey, that's the big three right there. You not only broken one law, you broke 3 laws, and you just get food. And the Sabbath police are here, and here's the rules. And it's fascinating that instead of defining 39 different ways that you could creatively rest on the Sabbath, they define 39 different ways that you could not break the Sabbath. It's a whole different purpose. It's a whole different meaning. And so what does Jesus do? Verse 25, he says, hey guys, don't you know your Old Testament? Haven't you read what the scroll says about David? Which is really a pretty fascinating question to ask of religious experts. Hey guys, don't you even know what it says? I'm sure that they really accepted that well. It's like, oh, really? I had missed that. Thanks for pointing to me. And what Jesus says is, haven't you read, verse 25, what David did? And the story is when David is on the run from Saul, he's being chased. Saul is trying to kill him. David goes to the tabernacle, and he goes inside, he talks to the priest, and he asks for the showbread, the table of the presence. And what that is it was 12 loaves of bread that were baked 1 day a week, and they would symbolize God's presence in the tabernacle. And they were only to be eaten by the priests. And what David, when he goes to the tabernacle, he says, hey, my guys are starving. Can you help us out? And the priest gives him the showbread, or the table of presence, as it's referred to in the ESV. And as you read that account, what is missing from that is there is no condemnation from God for that act. God allowed him to do it. And the implication is, as Jesus is asking that question, if David, who was considered the man after God's own heart, the most righteous man of his generation, could go into the tabernacle and break the rules, how much more can the Son of Man do that? Who not only created the world, but created the calendar as well. And if David could do it and not be condemned by God, how much more can I do this and find that God is pleased? And he goes on to say, the Sabbath was made for man. The purpose of the Sabbath, the purpose of the seventh day of the week, was to be a day of rest. As we mentioned before, most of our family lives in Southern California, in the LA area. 2 of our kids live down there now, and we've made so many trips up and down I-5 that we know every rest stop at McDonald's from Seattle to San Diego.